Ben Riggs presents Reading D&D Aloud. Episode 41, How to Design a World with Ed Greenwood.
Greetings, gentle humans. It is I, Ben Riggs. This is Reading Dungeons and Dragons Aloud. I am a apparently controversial historian, amateur demagogue, and it is difficult to introduce the person that we have on the podcast today, because typically I will come up with something kind of flowery, some sort of kind of WWE intro for the guest. Uh, but I think I'm just gonna say that with me is arguably the most successful Canadian fantasist in history. Um, when I was asking again my wife who's from Ontario about this last night, I said, "Who are the greatest Canadian sci-fi fantasy authors?" And she said Margaret Atwood first, and I'm like, "That's a good argument. I can see Margaret Atwood." But other than Margaret Atwood, I think on the fantasy side, the most successful Canadian may be the man with me now, Ed Greenwood, uh, creator of the Forgotten Realms, who's had books, novels, role-playing games, comic books, uh, big budget Hollywood productions, and apparently a Netflix show based in a world that he created. Um, Again, I don't know much about that Netflix show, but it was certainly all over my feed this weekend. Well, hopefully it happens. But did I miss anything, Ed? Is there anything else I should put in your introduction?
Oh gosh, no. Well, you should actually say there are lots and lots of good Canadian fantasy writers. Some of them, like Guy Gavriel Kay, with international success. I mean, I'm just a guy. But okay,
It's
yeah.
I mean, I will say, I interview a lot of people. It never ceases to amaze me how the people who are actually the most successful tend to be the most humble. When I'm interviewing the guys that were working on TSR West back in the late 80s, early 90s, oh man, the things they would tell me about their grandiose visions for how amazing it was going to be and how successful it was going to be and how sure they were going to be it was going to be a hit and then nothing. And then, I talked to Peter Adkison and he's just very casually talking about the foundation of Wizards of the Coast and you, for example. But can I think of another Canadian who's had their work adapted into as many media as you in the fantasy realm?
Okay, good point. Yeah. Yeah. Um, hmm. Well, Hardy Boys. Uh,
Not
so,
fantasy though, not fantasy.
oh, okay, yeah, yeah. Well, one could argue.
But see, again, here I am bumping against your natural humility. Um, because again, I thought about this last night. I was like, is he the most successful Canadian fantasist if you look at it in terms of, uh, you know, translations into other media and just success around the world? And I'm guessing it's you. Maybe you never thought of it that way before. Maybe you should get a T-shirt made. But again, I think that would bump against your humble nature.
A
Um,
t-shirt. Yes. I can get a t-shirt made. Um, my other wardrobe is in the wash. Yeah.
all right, I'll stop embarrassing you because I'm sure I am in fact embarrassing
No,
you.
I don't mind. This
Uh,
is fun.
so so this is going to be a facile question, but I have listeners that are 12 and I have listeners that are in their 70s. Uh, for the 12-year-olds, could you explain who you are and just the briefest version possible of the creation of the Forgotten Realms?
Sure. Okay. I am a 65 and a bit year old Canadian who have worked in public libraries since I was 14. I grew up in Don Mills, Ontario, was born in 59, grew up in the 60s, watched the Beatles rise. Okay, I'm that age. And I was a lonely kid. My mom died when I was 5 or 6. I was bookish and one of those things they call a child prodigy. So I'd read everything in my dad's den. And I would constantly ask my dad, what happened next? And I'd be waving some pulp magazine or a falling apart paperback. What happened next? And my father would always say, "Well, son, if you want to know what happened next, you're going to have to write it because that author died in 1938 or whatever."
What
So,
did your dad do for a living?
my dad was a radar physicist,
Wow.
and he installed radar in the mid Canada and Pine Tree lines of the um, stop the Russian bombers coming over the pole thingy. And then he later worked for Ferranti Packard, General Electric, and ended up as a professor in Ryerson,
Wow.
professor of physics.
Was your mom just at home or was she out in the workforce too?
Uh, my new mom had been a teacher. She quit doing that when she married my dad, and she was a writer. She wrote Canadian children's books. My dad actually collaborated with her on one book called Stand Up, Speak Out, which is on public speaking. Like
Wow.
if you're nervous and you have to speak in public, it was a little sort of guide. And yeah, my mom is still alive. She's retired from writing books. Um, like everybody in the family, she collects books, reads books, discusses books, hands books back and forth. But I think I'm the only dyed-in-the-wool gamer. My father did simulation games like Kriegspiel and the other military officers training because he was an officer in the Canadian military, so he did get the training. Um, and he would do the little paint the minis, Napoleonic cannons, that sort of stuff. And I got to my first Gen Con because of his interest in gaming.
Wow. Okay, when was your first Gen? I hear I was like, be brief, and now. Okay. So when was your first Gen Con?
Gen Con uh 8? Yeah,
Wow.
I was young. Um, we were in Chicago and we saw a poster stapled to a telephone pole. That yeah, I'm that old. And and it was a long drive home to Canada, and he really didn't want to go, but he dragged me there as cover for what he was doing. And I said, "Dad, I never asked for anything." And because I never pulled that thing on him, it worked on the one time I did it. And he was a country boy at heart. He'd grown up on farms. So as we drove out of Chicago, and up. We went up Route 12, Fox Lake, and up that way. And as we drove, he visibly relaxed. We were going to the country. And then when we got there, and it was like the horticultural hall with a bunch of sand tables and one ping pong table set up with wargaming stuff. And it was sand tables and little minis everywhere. And he just sort of like, ah. And then I had to drag him away for the drive home.
I have to ask, did you pick up a copy of D&D there?
No, no. We did nothing. I was a little kid. I got 25 cents a week allowance, and it ended when I was 14 and got a job in the public library. The allowance ended. Okay, you're earning your own now, son.
Ah,
That
well,
didn't work out so well.
it did work out. And I want to say D&D white box, I think it was $10 back in the day. So
Mhm.
at 25 cents a week, that would be quite a lot of saving to save up for the white box back in the old days.
Yeah, and as I recall from that convention, I didn't see a white box anywhere. I saw the three separate booklets
Okay, interesting.
in use. I mean, they were not set up to sell anything. There was no vendors hall at all. It was a room full of guys with pocket protectors in their chest pockets, and um, mainly guys. Although there were a lot of gals around, there were lots of wives and girlfriends, um, and they were mainly bearded and overweight like me, or skinny as a rail, and they were playing all sorts of war games with. They had uh, they bent coat hangers into blast circles for artillery. And I recall the ladies from the horticultural hall were not too pleased about that. And I think it was Jim Ward was reassuring them, we'll bring you coat hangers, we'll bring you replacement coat hangers, because they knew darn well that these things couldn't be bent back into proper shape, you know. And they also had slide rules and the tape measures that actually retracted into a little plastic carrying case were a new thing then. Most people had cloth tape measures that unrolled from a huge spool. And they were using those to see if their army could reach this on a charge, this move. And so
See,
it
no,
was
that's an
tape measure.
invention that I had not considered the date of its popularity. Like that's interesting. Retractable tape measures, 1970s. Okay, I will make sure I don't use those in my Call of Cthulhu campaigns.
Well,
Uh,
people had them, but you had to be rich and have a good hardware store.
hmm.
Most people had either this round spool with the ratchet thing, or particularly for seamstresses, homemakers, they just had a round cloth disc of wound up thing, and you with a little metal end on the thing, and you pulled it out by hand. You were holding it together by hand. It would collapse into a huge spaghetti if you didn't. That's yeah. There was a big gap between people with money to burn and people who were making do with stuff that had worked for years.
Did you actually play anything at Gen Con 8?
Uh, I stood there watching, and one of the players, one of these magnificent bearded men who were older than me, said, "Hey kid, what would you do?" And I said, "Well, I do this, and then I go around here." He goes, "Uh-huh, good strategy," and then stepped in front of me, between me and the table, and made the move he was going to make anyway.
Magnificent bearded men.
Well, they were like, most older men of my I grew up in a wealthy area, so they were either retired, wore alligator shirts and pushed lawnmowers around, and that was the only time I saw them on the weekends, or they were type A businessmen, buttoned down, captains of industry, and their hair was brill creamed to the individual strand. And they were like, they didn't step outside their door without their wife or their maid or their mistress, for all I know, dusting them down and putting their suitcase, their briefcase. They were accordion briefcases. Attaché cases hadn't come in yet and wouldn't for another decade. And they'd march away from their front door down to the bus stop because that was their common man touch. If they wanted to be hoity-toity, the limo showed up and took them. They had a driver. But I mean, so I wasn't used to seeing people who look vaguely like I do now. I saw them when we visited our grandparents in the rural regions. There were men like that, usually with canes and suspenders,
Huh.
walking around. Because
Well, I should add for people listening to this, would you describe your look as Merlin, Gandalf? I know you probably go Elminster. Um,
yeah,
is that the fair analogies?
I I I describe myself as rumpled. The local police described me as Dirty Santa. Hey, it's Dirty Santa
How do the
because
police have a description of you?
oh, okay. I now work in Port Hope. It is a small town.
Yes.
I am we just hired another male onto the library staff. And not counting pages, the young teenagers who shelf books, until that male came along, I was the only male they'd ever hired onto the staff since 1759 when the
Wow.
library opened. So the cops all know what I look like because I have a distinctive look and I stand out amongst the library ladies. And um, the library is a warming center, and the library is where homeless people may show up. So all the police are used to the library. Um, and if they don't know my name, and we all wear little magnetic name tags, and my name is pretty simple, Ed, okay? But sometimes if you're tired and it's a long shift and you've been mainlining coffee for most of it, you might not remember a short name. You just remember oh yeah, it's something short that we bark. And then so he goes, the guy at the library, oh, Dirty Santa. Yeah, that guy.
Wow. Okay. I will get us responsibly back. Now that I've gotten us into the Port Hope Police Department, I will get us
Zoo.
responsibly on track again. So, your father told you that you had to finish the stories of deceased authors. And I asked you, so, who are you and how did you create the realms? And I assume that we're working towards the creation of the realms here, but this is
Sure.
this is all good. I'm glad this is happening.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So I would go downstairs, and Aunt Clara, who was raising us, who'd been through two world wars and a depression, you did not buy paper on a farm. But every single person who went to get groceries, the plastic bag hadn't been invented yet, folks. You got them in big brown paper bags, and they were sturdy brown paper bags because they were meant to take the weight of everything you could buy, including lots of cans. So they came home. Aunt Clara took her kitchen cleaver, which was a repurposed World War II machete that had been sharpened so many times it was a tiny sliver of what it had begun life as. And she would slit the bag up both sides, and then she'd iron it just as she ironed all the clothes. She'd iron it flat, and it went downstairs to the den, to the card table, where there were metal players cigarette cartons, the packages full of crayons for my sisters, and an engineer's pencil for me. The pencils that have a flat side so they won't roll off the table. And I would write these pastiches of what happened next in this or that pulp paperback. And I loved two things in particular: Lord Dunsany's lyrically written short stories. I had a little more trouble with Clark Ashton Smith's short stories, but I went to the dictionary often to wade through those. Um, Robert E. Howard's Conan and the many competitors, Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter Mars, and Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and Grey Mouser in particular. And I admired the way the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories were self-contained stories that you didn't have to read any other one to enjoy it. They were episodes in the lives of this Mutt and Jeff team of heroes or anti-heroes, and they were all set in the same world. So I started writing my own stories of that ilk, which was Mert the Moneylender, who was this Falstaff paired with Poul Anderson's Nicholas Van Ryn from the Pulsatechnic League stories that just started to come out, coupled with Guy Gilpatrick's Glencannon, who was the drunken Scottish engineer um, on this tramp steamer in many men's magazines at the time. And before I go any further, men's magazines, I do not mean Playboy and Ilk, I mean men's magazines.
Back when
Um,
there were magazines and men would buy them.
yes, yeah, Esquire and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, and so he was a fat, wheezing, elderly, floppy, sea-booted guy with food stains all down his belly, who had been a thinking man's Conan in his earlier days and a mercenary captain, the Merciless. But he was now this old man. He could no longer outrun enemies. He had to outwit them. So I wrote these short stories where he was in a port city. He had rivals or enemies. He made new ones during the story, and he would leave town one floppy sea-booted stride ahead of the authorities who were now after him, his new enemies, and his old ones. So he was moving down the Sword Coast. And that was the genesis of the realms. I was
Nice.
5 or 6 at the time.
So, what does it feel like to be writing in the same world for 60 years?
Oh God, I'm tired. No, no. It feels fine because the more you write in it, and the more other people write in it and bring it to life and surprise me with it, the more alive it seems. It's like I'm talking about a real place. It's as if somebody said to you, "Okay, Ben, we need a shelf full of books in our local bookstores that you write. Pulse pounding, stirring things, but they all have to be set in Wisconsin. You can choose any era in Wisconsin. You can write in all of them. Probably not in the same book. But I mean, and you would mine Wisconsin, right? You go back to the beginning. You tell native stories. You tell the opening of the West. Everything that offered um an adventure hook, and that's what I've done with the realms.
A thing I was also thinking about right before this interview is, in tabletop role-playing games, it feels like there's really three domains of writing. There's, creating rules and writing rule books. There's creating worlds and settings for those rules, and then creating adventures. And it never occurred to me before that I have not had many people on who are probably primarily known for world creation, unless you would disagree with that in some way. Um, but when I think of you, I think everyone thinks of the realms, Elminster. So I would say I would ask the following question, and maybe this follows up after your perfectly after your writing seminar yesterday. But if you were going to start over again, if you were going to create a whole new world, um, of any kind, fantasy, sci-fi, where and how would you begin?
Hmm. Okay. I create new worlds all the time. I created a new one 2 months ago for somebody else. And I always start with a story. What is the root story you want to tell? Now, I don't mean that you should tailor the world to that, because the problem with tailoring the world to that is it looks like the Lord of the Rings or the original Dragonlance, because you've wrapped the world around one epic story. Now, the realms, they asked me, what's the elevator pitch for the realms? Jeff Grubb said, how would you explain it? Because I'm going to have to explain it to my bosses. And I said, it's the world of a thousand stories,
I
not
should
one.
briefly shout out Jeff Grubb was the guy at TSR that kind of brought Ed in to make the first Forgotten Realms products, although he'd pre-created and had things published in Dragon. Sorry. Go ahead,
Yeah,
continue,
yeah,
please.
yeah. Yeah, and in fact, that's how Jeff discovered the realms, reading my Dragon articles. But yeah, the realms is the world of a thousand stories, not one. And that was the selling point, because TSR needed a kitchen sink world, as Jeff put it, um, in which to park various disparate things, like the Desert of Desolation modules, which had Egyptian pyramids in them, and other things they published that didn't fit in any of their world settings. And they needed a new world that wasn't Greyhawk, because they didn't want to, line
Hey,
Gary's
Gary.
pockets. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, and Dragonlance had taken all of the company's resources in 2 years, hundreds of people. They were looking at that endeavor in a rather daunting way. We don't have the time and money for that. Why don't we just buy a world? Do you know of any? Well, there's this guy in Dragon. So I mean, that's how that started. But yeah, I would start a new world with what is the root story you want to tell? What's your intended audience? What's the tale? Because that will determine how you view the story at the beginning, our first look at it. And like, for instance, just to use Harry Potter for the moment, you start with the mundane, our world, because Harry is living with another family, and the owls start arriving and all that sort of stuff. And you take us via Hogwarts Express from you, and you are being told all the way through there are things that aren't the same as our real world. The platform that only they can find, and so on. And then you literally take a train into, oh, a place where a school for wizards. And it's sort of like you're being gently ushered into the world of the fantastic that is coexisting with the mundane world, and the mundanes don't even know it, sort of thing. And that's one way into a world, okay? But that's how do we introduce the world? Because just to step back from a practical publishing side, these things could get canceled at any time. You could run out of money, the publisher could go under, attention could turn elsewhere. So how you view the world at the beginning pushes the attention spotlight, like the little cartoon where the guy's running all over the stage and the spotlight is not following him until he doesn't want it to, because he has to adjust his clothing or something, and then ta-da! Uh, uh, you want you're dragging the spotlight in one direction or another by what is being published. So think about that before you launch. How do you want to present the world to us? For instance, we were we have a mutual friend, Alex Kammer, and he published a detailed fantasy city as a standalone product. If that was the only product he ever published in that setting, then a consumer, a reader, a gamer could be forgiven for thinking the world is a city and nothing else but a city, if you see what I mean. So you have to decide how we're going to use the world, how you're going to, are we going to begin with a novel? Is the novel going to be, as I was instructed to do for Spellfire, be a travel novel? Not so much a quest, but a travel novel that showed us a lot of that part of the realms. Because they want, show us the realms, was my brief. And then the editors started chopping this gigantic novel that into a trilogy and then into a single novel, and all that stuff dropped off it as they chopped off arms, legs, livers, all the various organs.
Could I read part of your, for lack of a better way of putting it, introduction to the realms?
Sure.
So this is from Dragon Magazine number 74. It is entitled Seven Swords, Blades of the Realms. And obviously, this is not, I don't think this is the first appearance by Elminster, unless you're going to tell me differently. But I just at random grabbed a article to show people an example of what you're talking about here with the realms and getting people into it, because I think the way that you introduced the realms in Dragon Magazine speaks to what you're talking about, unless you tell me I'm wrong. Um, so we
Nope,
begin
you're not
with
wrong.
no spells tonight, Elminster said with a smile. It is of swords I would speak. Swords? Magic swords, I take it? I asked, settling myself in the chair across from him. Elminster grinned through his curling beard. As ever, your mind runs swiftly on a narrow track. Yes, magic blades. But only after I tell you of the famed swords of this world, for I am most interested in the toing and froing betwixt both our worlds. Mayhap some blades have made the journey. No problem, I replied, reaching for this, that, and the other books from the shelves surrounding us both. Thus armed, I told the old sage of King Arthur's Excalibur and Arundite, blade of Sir Launcelot of the Lake. I spoke of Charlemagne's Joyeuse and Flamberge, the Flame Cutter, and the swords of his stalwart paladins Roland, Durandal, Oliver, Glorious, and Hauteclair, which means very bright. Uh, Rogero, Balisarda, and Rinaldo, Frusberta. I turned to Siegfried and told the sage of that hero's swords, Gram, which means grief, Mimung, and Balmung. I read from Spencer of the Blades, Chrysaor, and Sanglamore, and then passed on what I could find of the Cid's blade, Tizana, Ogier the Danes, Courtaine, the very short sword, and Salvagine, I'm gonna say, and Salvagine. Sir Bevis's Morglay, Big Glaive, and almost 100 more. I read from old books, modern fantasy stories, and guidebooks to royal regalia until the night had quite gone, and Elminster had filled his pipe almost 40 times. When I ran down, he nodded approvingly at me in the gray half dawn. Sorry, I gotta go to the top of the page. Your tongue proved even longer than I had hoped, he said. I recognized no blade of the realms with certainty in all your gabble, but no matter. In return, I will tell you of 7 blades of power. Oh, yes, there are countless others, but only 7 this time, mind. Blades that I have seen with my own eyes in the realms. What he said thereafter, I have set down below. And speaking as a reader and huge nerd, the framing device of Elminster coming to your house and talking to you, and you first telling him about famous blades in our world, and then him telling you about famous blades in the realms, is so engaging and charming and dear. And when you talk about creating a world that feels like ours, Ken Hite would always say, when you're talking about world creation, you start with Earth and you translate it into something else. And whether you agree with that or not, like you are here at least starting with, well, we are in Earth, and we're going to frame it through the lens of these earthly famous swords. And now I'm going to tell you about the ones in the realms. And again, I can see why this would have just jumped out of Dragon Magazine and into the subconscious of Jeff Grubb, and that he would then call you up when they were like looking for a world about this. But anyway, please, anything you want to say about this, other than just listening to me enthuse?
No, no, no. That's okay. I read Dragon. Everybody in the industry, if they could get their hands on it, read Dragon. Which is why the device of Elminster, the unreliable narrator, exists. Because if you're reading Dragon, you're a dungeon master, you can just take this stuff and use it. And if you don't have time, it is the role playing aid that you're paying for to save you time. But if you know your characters are reading over your shoulder, or a player at your table could have read somebody else's copy of Dragon, you need an unreliable narrator um, to give the DM fiat to change things. So if the person is just operating from memory and goes, oh, no, wait a minute, I know it's waiting in the next room, you can force them back into experiencing the immersion of a game by the next room is different. And also, I was a mild-mannered Canadian, and it felt really embarrassing to say, "Hi, my name's Ed Greenwood, and I thought of a new way of rolling dice that none of you schmucks have thought of before. So here it is. Here's my article." I thought that's a bit forward. Uh, why don't we just like frame it through this cantankerous guy, Elminster, who will say things that I could never say in public to people. And it's a handy device. You know, I cue Oliver Hardy. Here's another fine mess you've gotten us into. You know, so hence that. But yeah, the other thing is, I was conscious of the fact that each month, if you were lonely, didn't have a gaming a crew around you, and by the way, folks, the internet didn't exist then yet. You were on your own. If you lived in lower left Overboot, Saskatchewan, or Paducah, you were on your own. If you were alone, you were alone. The magazine was your monthly window into this wonderful world, and I wanted it to be a good read, something you could read a second time. So it wasn't just, here's the stuff, and serve it forth. Something you would say, let me go back and read that again. That was fun. And imagine this guy talking to Elminster. That's what I wanted. I wanted you to have a little transport of delight, a little transport out of your mundane life where, oh, homework's due, your mom wants you to clean your room, you have to do your laundry, you're late for this, and, you know,
Um, Joseph Laycock, who, I have no idea if you're aware of his work, but he's an academic who studies all kinds of interesting, weird, geeky stuff. We had him on the show, and he would talk about how Dungeons and Dragons creates a space outside of this world from which you can then re-examine this world. And again, that framing device just seems to make the implicit mythologically specific in a wonderful way. And to be clear, you are the narrator in the Dragon article, right?
yes, yeah.
Elminster. So I have to ask, how um when I've read these, uh I have always read them as though these were things that actually happened to you. But I'm assuming you did not actually have visions of Elminster visiting you, unless you tell me I'm wrong and you did have visions of Elminster. So
Eh,
how did you come up with the idea for the framing devices, or was it just you'd be sitting in the bathtub and be like, "Oh, we'll talk about swords, and then I can talk about real world swords and da 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 da."
No, no, I wanted a guy like Elminster to come and visit me. Uh, I had various uncles, and even if they weren't actually uncles, they were courtesy uncles. One of them was an eminent Canadian writer, W.G. Hardy. Um, he was actually my cousin twice removed or whatever, but he was Uncle George because he was that much older than me. He was the same age as, and he was a man of letters, and he's best remembered these days as either the first chancellor of the University of Alberta or the guy who started men's amateur hockey internationally, and the Hardy Cup is named for. Anyway, but he grew up on a small farm in Ontario, and he read all the classics, and he was a novelist and wrote, lots of Roman Empire novels,
Hmm.
But he would visit from time to time, and we were a cheap date, as in he'd get a good dinner and a bed to sleep in, didn't have to go to a hotel, and in return he'd tell stories while sitting around and Elminster was sort of like evoking the people I wanted to visit more often. And I grew up yeah, and I grew up in a neighborhood that had ravines, where streams cut and stream valleys, and they left them for flood control, thank goodness, because that meant we got parks. And everybody could walk in the ravines and walk their dogs and so on. But there'd be a little bit of the ravine that had a pass and was cleaned up and had garbage receptacles for people. And then there was the wild part of the ravine around the banks of the stream that they left because they could see every time we had a heavy rainstorm the destructive power of the water as it cut a new channel for the stream and ripped up their bridges and so on, and they had to put them back in again. Uh, so they left that bit, and that's where all of us teenage kids played. But it was like right next door to our houses, so we could play in the ravine and then come up the street covered with mud home. And I was thinking, yeah, now Minster's coming out of the ravine and in through my back door, and nobody notices him because he's a wizard. He could.
I mean, mythologically, again, that's very striking to me. Again, I always think of ideas as coming out of some sort of void or wild within all of us. So it's really striking to me the idea that you're thinking of Elminster coming out of those ravines. And it is also striking to me how often when I go to parks that I would frequent when I was younger, how often I end up thinking about D&D because like for me D&D was very much a literary pursuit. Like my D&D years were 7th and 8th grade and I had no friends, but I avidly consumed D&D literature for those years. And then in high school I kind of moved on to White Wolf and Palladium for a while and some other and Call of Cthulhu. Uh, but again, D&D was always there, just reminding me of those years, and for those years they were really dear. Ironically, I play more D&D now than I ever have before in my life. But
Right.
so having it come out of the ravine is so striking. Um, so let me ask you this. So you said when you're creating a fantasy world, you want to start with a story, but you said you you don't want it to end up like Dragonlance or Lord of the Rings, where it's a world kind of constructed to tell this one story, and then outside of that story, it has some problems. Um, how would you then, again, if you're talking to someone who wants to write a fantasy novel or really create their own world, how would you walk the line between those two things of creating a story but not falling into Dragonlance or Lord of the Rings?
Well, okay. The problem with the problem with Dragonlance and Lord of the Rings is it's a world it's a war to end all wars. It's everybody's caught up in it. It's like World War One or World War Two. It's not going to leave anyone untouched. Um, and now, ironically, there are exceptions to that, which like Tolkien makes it clear to us that most of the hobbits in the Shire have no idea of what's going on, you know, and they don't want to. They're insular. Um, but of course, by the end of the book, the war comes to them, Sharky, you know. Um, but what I meant by that was I want the world to, when you first look at it, have lots of stories going on, not one big one. And therefore, the player characters or the reader, as viewpoint, is a small cog in many large wheels, not one large wheel. And the world has a life beyond them. It's been going on, trundling along before you first see it. It's going to go on after you stop seeing it. And that's what I meant, that the world
I gotcha.
should have a life of its own and be wider than the first story that you're telling, because then it means, oh, this is going to go on forever. Um, there can be other stories here. And what that means is if, for instance, it is becomes a shared world, so suddenly an author I may not have ever met, of a different gender, a different age, and a different background, like a young American lady. Okay, I'm Canadian. I'm a guy. Is suddenly writing stories in my world, and I mean on at least two occasions that has happened with Elaine Cunningham and with Aaron Evans.
Yeah, I had
And
Aaron Evans on less than a month ago, actually.
okay, yeah, there you go. And it's like these people read my mind. This is the realms. It's come to life. Wonderful, because now I've got new realm stories that I didn't write, so they can surprise me. I can read them along and experience the world, and it feels alive because I'm not pulling the strings of the marionettes on the page in the story. Somebody else has done it. So the world has to be wide enough to give them room so they can create stuff they want, but they don't have to wholesale create a new kingdom or something because all I gave them was this tunnel vision. What Elminster referred to in that passage you read, your mind as usual runs quickly along a very narrow track. He's really getting at, I want it to be broad. I want you to feel there's a whole world out there because that way it feels real because that's how we experience our world around us. So it's another step in making the thing feel real. Oh my goodness, there's a lot more going on here. We can peel it back. And then the beginner's mistake is to then sit down and do lineages of kings and noble families in this one spot back till the earth cooled. Because that, and the mistake is that's your time sink. You're devoting your time to that rather than what do they eat? What does it smell like on the banks of this river? Um, what do the little scurrying things look like? What do the fruit look like? Can I trust the herbs to do the same thing that the herbs do in our real world when we use them in either cooking or for medicine? Or am I inventing lots of new ones? Am I mixing them? So we have oak trees and maple trees, but we also have diddly squats or something that we don't have in the real world. That's where make the place feel real. That has to come first. And who was king 800 years ago can go second, unless that king is undead and is walking around now. You know,
Well, that is a remarkable segue to the first edition Forgotten Realms box set, um, which because of when I got into D&D, it was with the second edition box set, which was also very, very good. But I'm going to say about 7 or 8 years ago, I had to pick up the PDF of the first edition box set for my book. And I looked into it and I was like, absolutely blown away by how well it has aged. Because obviously the first edition uh, game rules, yeah, you're probably not going to use those, but the setting material is so good. And listeners have heard me prattle on incessantly about inspiration. That the a excellent RPG product has to demand it be run. It has to inspire a DM to run it. And that first edition box set, man, I can see why uh, like it has in some ways made you the most successful Canadian fantasist of all time. Because even to this day, it really demands to be run. Uh, but when you talk about, hey, people spending time on lineages and not the things that matter, when we were talking about what to read for this, you suggested reading a passage from page 33 of the DM's guide.
39, 39.
39,
I got
sorry.
the page wrong.
Yeah, from page 39, the month of August, Elysias. Would you mind reading a few paragraphs of that for us, Mr. Greenwood?
Not at all. Are you sitting comfortably?
I have my
I'll
tea. I'm
begin.
great.
Good. Alucer Nicasia, youngest daughter of Azun IV, king of Cormyr, has run away, vanishing from the royal palace in Suzail in early spring. Her reasons and destination are unknown, but she is said to have been recognized in Tilverton, and that the army sent there was intended primarily to bring about her safe return, rather than to aid Tilverton's besieged inhabitants. Forces of Scardale have taken the fields of Battledale and now hold Harrowdale, Featherdale, and much of Battledale. The trade road from Sembia to the Standing Stone has not yet been blocked, and Assembra is still nominally independent. Travelers on the road, including caravans out of Hillsfire, Zentral Keep, Cormyr, and Sembia, have been just dropped and stirched by largely mercenary forces of Lord Lashen. Public statements have been made by the ruler of Zentral Keep, Arkandale, and Sembia that if the road is blocked, and the taking of Asembra, Archendale warns, is synonymous with blocking the road, Scardale will find itself economically and eventually on the battlefields at war with all three. The Citadel of the Raven has been revealed to have been largely destroyed in the attack by three dragons and is now being rebuilt by Zentalkeep's work parties. The great armory of the Citadel contained many great siege engines, and with those two of the drakes were ultimately slain. One of the younger dragons escaped, flying west towards the border forest. The citadel was largely gutted in the battle, and over 9,000 warriors perished. It is feared that if the defenses at the citadel are not very strong by winter, the ogres of Thar will come south from the glaciers to attack the cities on the north coast of the Moonsea.
And those are events that would take place in Elysias of I forget what year from the from that book, but it's things that would be happening in the realms, right?
Right, yeah. Now the reason the first one said was sort of in the past tense is there are no newspapers. There's no internet. This stuff is spreading by caravans and word of mouth as people sit in the taverns and talk. It's like the ultimate rumor mill, but everything's delayed.
Yeah, and again, it that is very it's also tactile. It's also granular. Like you can pick up any one of those and set an adventure around it if it inspires you. Why did you want to pick those events to talk about?
I wanted events that were um, the moving and shaking events that we would get on the news in the real world. They tend to happen, most stuff in the real world happens to other people somewhere else, distant in the world, but it's going to affect us, as in the rains down in Africa, they are going to affect the prices of bananas or whatever. Okay. Um, Oil is going to go up because there's war in the Middle East or whatever. You know, it's going to have an effect on our household here at home, but it happens somewhere else, conveniently, somewhere else. But not so far away that if you're an adventurer and you're going to run towards the danger rather than away from it, you can't make use of it. In other words, it informs the things the dungeon master wants to do. If he has a strange group of adventurers show up and challenge your group of adventurers in the tavern, they may be on the run from one of these big battles. I mean, it sounds to me they're like the Dales, or at least the Eastern Dales, at that time. War is running amok. So there'll be refugees, people who just want to get away from there. They'll be on the move. So now you have new people on your roads. So that's the way and it makes the world feel alive. There's stuff happening that your player characters or your viewpoint in the novel didn't cause and weren't there to see. I mean, one of the most popular TV series when I was a little kid is You Are There, and it was a guy interviewing an actor dressed up as Hitler or Julius Caesar, or why did you do this? What Hannibal? Why did you cross the Alps? But the appeal of being there when the decision makers think, well, uh, this is stuff that happens when you aren't there. So to keep the world from becoming a lifeless stage in which all the actors are frozen in a tableau with dust settling on their eyeballs, not moving. And then your player characters walk onto the stage and the lights come up and everybody walks and talks and moves and your characters walk off the other end of the stage and darkness falls and everybody's, no, I want the world to feel alive around you at all times.
Who do you think has done an exceptional job of world building in any media? And again, you can feel free to say Tolkien or the classics if you want to, but who do you look at and think, wow, they've done a really good job doing what I did?
there are a bunch of them, um, and for different reasons. Tolkien made his world feel real, and yet it has some big lacks in it. Um, Lots of important female characters, an organized religion with priests or clergy of any sort. They're just not there. Now, you can look back on them and say, hey, they're not there. But when you're swept up in the story, you don't notice. The world has come alive. So he's done it. He's successfully world built. Um, Guy Kay, Guy Gavriel Kay, the Canadian fantasy writer, who writes, okay, his first trilogy reads like a cross between King Arthur, Stonehenge, University of Toronto students, and Tolkien, because he was helping Christopher Tolkien put all of Tolkien's notes together for all of those many books that have come out since Tolkien's death that chronicle the Middle Earth from Tolkien's notes. But each successive work he's done since then has moved further away from that, and they are historical fantasies, as in they'd take a fantasy version of a time and place in our real world and tell a fantasy story. And because they are based so closely on our real world, but a fantasy version of it, you can see the world building right in front of you and really admire it. He's made tiny changes. There's tiny bits of magic. Like the world is not unlike the realms and D&D. The world is not rife with magic. It has tiny touches of it here and there, and how it feels the same so that we can identify with it, and yet very different. So anything can happen because it's not our world. So I can admire that world bit. Um, there are other world building things that I admire more for their scope than their skill. If you read the old Doc Smith Lensman stories, this huge galaxies and everything feels coherent. There are some horrible flaws in that Doc Smith didn't know how to write woman and love scenes. And you will read some of those love scenes and go, oh, you big clunky clunker, says the woman as she folds herself into the arms of the guy. And you go, ah, but at the same time, his vast galaxies feel real. This, even though he's writing increasingly cartoonish, I mean, it is the epitome of space opera. Um, when you're in the tale, you're gripped with a sense of wonder. It feels real. And of course, the early scenes in Triplanetary were based partially in things he did during the war and so on. So they do feel real. But anybody who can do a coherent galaxy, Trek, Star Wars, they I have to admire even when there are the occasional pratfalls. I can remember chuckling for minutes at a time when Bill Slavicsek, did the little handbook for Star Wars, and oh, there isn't just Jabba the Hutt, there's Zorba the Hutt. Really, Zorba the Hutt? And
What's
yet,
wrong with Zorba?
yeah. Well, because I'm Zorba the Greek.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
and
gosh, Nikos, I'm not even
yeah,
going to try and pronounce his last name.
yeah, yeah. And then of course, to a kid, you go Zorba the Greek, and then you go Jimmy the Greek, because you see him on TV doing the odds at that time. So I mean, it was like I'm being jolted out of the fantasy world into the mundane. In the same way that if you make a mistake in the middle of your fantasy um, novel, and you say that an assassin's going to be hired to kill the rival king, and will pay him $10,000, and you go, dollars? There are little things that will jolt you out of it, and yet in those vast shared collaborative ones, even though there's the occasional clangor, the occasional thing that doesn't fit, and that's to be expected because there's so many hands at work, too many hands in the kitchen sort of thing. Um, the world survives it. You push it aside because your willing suspension of disbelief works because you are invested in the world, and therefore the world building has worked.
Okay, we're running out of time. Let me. What other?
Oh
I know. What other advice would you give to world builders again in any medium? So, if your first piece of advice is start with a story, what else would you say?
Tell me a story is number one. The characters that I spend the most time with on the page, make them good company. Make me want to hang out with them. That doesn't mean they have to be nice people. They don't have to be grandfatherly types or the cuddly person you wish was sharing your bed. They can be dastardly villains, but make them good company. Vincent Price did an entire career of doing vaguely creepy people that you probably wouldn't want to share a bed with or trust with your back in a sword fight. But he was irresistible. You wanted to see and hear what he would do next. Okay, make your characters good company because then the reader, the viewer will come back for more. They will want more. So those are the two big ones. And then third thing would be tell a coherent story. There can be contradictions because you have unreliable narrators, because you have people seeing things in different ways, and you could even rub the reader's nose in that at the beginning, and many mystery writers do, where they have a single event, like somebody's murdered in a room full of like six people, and the six witnesses all describe it very differently to the police, and you're reading it going, "What? Were you even in the same room?" Because it's so different. But so you can rub people's noses in the fact that there's unreliable stuff there and people are lying. Oh my goodness. But I need to trust in something as a reader. I need to trust in something in life. All too often in real life, I can't trust in something. If I'm wasting, or hopefully it isn't wasting, if I am investing time, minutes in my life that I will never have back in this entertainment, give me something I can trust in. Give me some hope. And that's the next thing. Give me hope. I want hope.
You seem like a optimistic, healthy-minded person in the William James sense. Um, how is it just by nature? How do you maintain your optimism?
I wake up every morning and I've woken up. Hooray! Victory! I start the day with a victory. Think of that, folks. When you wake up because the alarm clock's going and you don't want to get up and you don't want to go out into the cold, cold world and you don't want to bathe or shower and you don't want to put clothes on and go to a job you hate, you already had a victory. You woke up that morning. Now you have
That
a day in front of you. You will never have that day back. Do something in the day to make somebody else smile, and you will feel better because you made somebody else's day better. Number one. Number two, look for something new in the day, something that you haven't thought of before. Oh, look, a ladybug settled on my finger. I've never noticed how their wings unfold from on top of each other before. Hmm, something new and different that you haven't thought about. And the world will be full of wonder without you being rich, beautiful, famous, having bed partners galore, um, taking numbers to elbow their way in. Uh, you don't need any of those things. You may want them. That's where the hope comes in. But it you can find this small victory in the day, and that will be enough. I had a granddaddy who said that to me once because he was one of these guys who'd like had a hard life, physically a hard life on the farm, and there were a lot of things that gave him pain, and you could tell by the way he walked as an elderly man. He was in pain, and he would collapse into a chair with a sigh, you know, and he would pick up a cup of tea and he'd say, "Yeah, well, we had some small victories today, and that'll be enough." And I thought, wow, he's satisfied with that. And I admired him, so I wanted to be like him. So without even thinking about it, I'm like him. My dad was like that too. Um, he may have been stewing inside and he was capable of the really tart comment when nobody else was around to hear it except the person he wanted to hear it. But he was a jovial fellow who was upbeat and took life in its stride because, hey, he knew there were going to be pratfalls. There were going to be hurdles we had to jump over. And I once said to him, "Oh, geez, not another thing." And he goes, "Son, life is hurdles. That's living. Tripping over the next hurdle. So, see that next hurdle over there? Take a good run at it."
So how can people support your work? What should they buy? What should they subscribe to? What should they consume?
Oh my goodness. Well, okay. Number one, I have a Patreon. So if you're into the realms, I will answer realms lore questions there, and I will also do realms essays. You can see them later on YouTube for free. Um, and you can also go to Greenwood's Grotto on Discord. Particular, again, if you're into the realms, we discuss the realms, and a lot of realms creators drop by there, and we discuss things. We help each other with where you can find this, or where there's a map of this. If I'm looking for a barber shop in the upper city of Baldur's Gate, where should I go? And various of us will answer you. Um, and yeah, that's basically it. And if you're into Vikings, for 3.5 years now, and it's probably going to take me another 3.5, I've been helping my friend Andrew Vlakoskas, who has a Viking role-playing game that does not use dice, um, called Fate of the Norns. I have been detailing Viking ruled Dublin, and it really happened in our real world. The Vikings conquered Dublin and ruled. I'm doing a fantasy version of that, a complete detailed city. So, thousands of buildings, completely detailed, each one with at least one NPC in them, that a non-player character, a person you could meet there, who has a dirty secret, because in this game you can have social combat, known to you and me as blackmail. And to do that, you need to know a dirty secret. So you can sidle up to someone and say, "It would be a pity if the king ever learned who it was who stole his favorite underwear." And uh, I have to detail all this stuff, so it takes me forever, and I've been doing that. So drop by and buy one of the books. And here's the benefit. If you don't play Fate of the Norns, you can borrow a city block out of the middle of one of these books and put it in your own fantasy city when you're DMing whatever you're playing, or you can just draw on it when you're writing about an urban or built up area in your fantasy fiction. Just change the names. You will want to change the names because both the Celts, the Hibernians, the future Irish, and the Norse, the Vikings, they have no surnames. They have bynames. So everybody is Amundsen or Bodardadottir or whatever. Or they have a rude nickname like the Farter or Ship's Breast or whatever it is. It's usually physical and it's usually rude. Uh, so you will want to change those names unless you want to write in that particular setting. So that would be the other thing I'd say to check out for fun. And you can find me everywhere because I have a lot of friends because I've been in gaming for a long time. So I step in and write a lot of things for a lot of people. I'm working with GUI Cube right now. We're doing the Environs of Giesengax and Trouble with Rats and so on, and there will be more.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I will make sure that I put a link to your Patreon in the show notes. Go forth and support Ed there. Ed, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk today. I really appreciate. Oh, I should shout out briefly. We have a Patreon for this too. Only $3 a month. You get extra episodes. I have an episode where Ken Hite is talking to Call of Cthulhu creator Sandy Peterson. I have a fellow historian interviewing Peter Atkinson. Those episodes will be coming up in the next 8 weeks. I'm performing both of those interviews this week, so I'd imagine one of them will be up in less than 7 days. And hey, it's only $3 a month. And I keep posting historical data that I am digitizing. Last week, I posted all the sales numbers for, I think, every Forgotten Realms product from 1994 through 1996, novels included, which I don't have a ton of data on. So, hey, if you're into the Forgotten Realms and you want to know all about sales numbers from those 3 years, I posted them on my Discord last week. $3 gets you access. Unless Ed wants them, and then I'll just send them to him for free. But with that, Ed, I can't thank you enough for being on the show. You have a great Sunday.
Yeah, you too. This was fun. Thank you for having me.